Picture this. You're driving through a forgotten stretch of rural America when you spot it. A small white church, paint peeling like dead skin, standing alone against the darkening sky. The windows glow with a sickly yellow light that shouldn't exist in a building abandoned for over 40 years. But here's what will make your blood run cold. Inside that church, behind those rotting doors, 37 people have been sitting in the same wooden pews since 1983. Their eyes fixed forward, their bodies frozen in prayer, listening to a sermon that never, ever stops. How long would you last if you couldn't leave, couldn't move, couldn't even close your eyes while a voice droned on eternally from the pulpit? What if I told you that one journalist discovered exactly what happens when you interrupt a sermon that's been going for decades? The story of Black Hollow Church begins like any other investigation into abandoned places, with a reporter named Sarah Chen receiving an anonymous tip about strange lights in a church that burned down in a fire that killed its entire congregation. But Black Hollow Church never burned. That's just what the county records want you to believe. The truth is far more terrifying, because when Sarah slipped through those doors with her camera rolling, she found something that defied everything she thought she knew about reality. The congregation sat there in their Sunday best, clothes from another era, their skin paper-thin and translucent. But their eyes, God, their eyes were alive and pleading, screaming silently for help while their bodies remained perfectly, horrifyingly still. The preacher at the pulpit never looked up, never paused for breath, his voice echoing through the sanctuary in a continuous stream of words that seemed to pull at your very soul, drawing you into the pews where you'd take your seat and never, ever leave. If you want to hear more terrifying stories from forgotten roads and abandoned places, hit that subscribe button now. Because what you're about to witness will change how you see every empty church you pass on those lonely country roads. Sarah Chen had covered abandoned places before. Decrepit motels where shadows moved behind broken windows. Gas stations where pumps still dripped fuel decades after closing. But nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming wrongness that pressed against her the moment she stepped inside Black Hollow Church. The air itself felt thick, almost solid, like walking through invisible cobwebs that clung to her skin and tried to pull her forward toward the pews where those 37 souls sat trapped in their eternal vigil. Her camera captured it all. The way dust motes hung perfectly still in the air, defying physics. The way the preacher's mouth moved in perfect synchronization, with words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And most disturbingly, the way one woman in the third row slowly, impossibly slowly, turned her head just enough to look directly at Sarah with eyes that held decades of silent screaming. The sermon itself was incomprehensible at first. A stream of biblical verses mixed with something older, something that predated Christianity. Words in languages that shouldn't exist spoken with such conviction that they burrowed into Sarah's mind like parasites. She tried to back away, but her feet felt heavy, and she realized with growing horror that the closer she got to the congregation, the harder it became to move, as if the church itself was digesting her, pulling her into its terrible communion. The preacher's voice never wavered, never stopped. Even when Sarah called out, asking if anyone could hear her, even when she screamed for help, even when she tried to grab the shoulder of the nearest congregant, only to feel her hand pass through clothing that looked solid but felt like touching a memory. Through her camera's viewfinder, she could see something else. Dark tendrils of something that might have been smoke or might have been something far worse, wrapping around the ankles and wrists of every person in those pews, holding them in place like spiritual shackles that had been tightening for 40 years. The most terrifying moment came when Sarah realized she could understand fragments of the sermon now. Not the words, but the meaning behind them. A promise of salvation through suffering, of redemption through endless listening, of paradise achieved only when every soul in the church had heard every possible combination of every word that could ever be spoken. She felt her knees beginning to bend, her body wanting to sit, to join them, to finally rest after what felt like a lifetime of standing. And it was only the weight of her camera, the last anchor to the world outside, that gave her the strength to stumble backward toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, she heard something that made her blood turn to ice. Her own voice, coming from the pulpit, reading the news story she had planned to write about this place, the words she hadn't even typed yet, flowing from the preacher's mouth as if he had always known she would come. As if her arrival had been part of the sermon all along. Another verse in an endless liturgy that would continue until the last star burned out in the sky. Sarah's legs gave out just as she reached the door, collapsing to her knees while the preacher's voice continued reciting her unwritten article word for word, describing how she would escape this place, how she would call the authorities, how they would find nothing but an empty church with no sign of the congregation she'd filmed. And worst of all, how she would return again and again, drawn back by dreams of those pleading eyes, until one day she would take her permanent seat in the fourth row, second pew from the back. The camera fell from her hands, clattering across the warped floorboards. And in that moment of disconnection from her electronic tether to reality, she saw the truth of Black Hollow Church. The building itself was breathing, expanding and contracting with each word of the eternal sermon, feeding on the trapped souls like a massive organism that had learned to disguise itself as a place of worship. She crawled toward her camera, fingernails scraping against wood that felt warm and wet beneath its veneer of age. And as her fingers closed around the device, she heard the congregation shift for the first time in 4 decades. 37 heads turning in perfect unison to watch her struggle. The preacher's words shifted too, no longer reading her future, but speaking directly to her, telling her about the others who had come before. The state trooper in 1987 who still sat in uniform in the back row, the teenage vandals from 1994 whose spray paint cans remained clutched in their frozen hands, the census worker from 2010 who had simply wanted to update county records and now formed part of the eternal congregation. Sarah managed to stand, using every ounce of will to resist the gravitational pull of those empty spaces in the pews. And as she stumbled toward the exit, she understood with perfect clarity that the door would open, that she would escape, that everything the sermon predicted would come true because the preacher wasn't prophesying. He was programming reality itself through words that had been spoken so many times they had worn grooves in the fabric of existence. The last thing she recorded before fleeing into the night was the sound of applause. 37 pairs of hands clapping in slow, mechanical rhythm while the preacher's voice rose to a crescendo, announcing that Sister Sarah would return for evening service, that her seat was already prepared, that her hymnal was open to the correct page, waiting for her voice to join the choir that sang without sound, praised without breath, and worshiped without end. Outside, gasping in the cold night air, Sarah discovered that 3 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Her phone filled with missed calls from her editor. And when she played back the footage, she found only static and the sound of her own voice reading scripture. She didn't remember learning, couldn't remember speaking in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood perfectly. She drove away knowing she would return, feeling the pull already starting in her bones, hearing the sermon continuing in the whisper of her tires on asphalt, in the rhythm of her heartbeat, in the spaces between her thoughts, where the preacher's voice had taken root and begun to grow, sprouting words that would eventually bloom into an irresistible compulsion to take her place among the congregation of Black Hollow Church. The drive home became a waking nightmare as Sarah's hands trembled on the steering wheel. The preacher's voice echoing in her rearview mirror like a passenger she couldn't see but could feel breathing down her neck. And when she finally reached her apartment, she discovered that her fingernails had left bloody crescents in her palms from gripping so tightly against the pull to turn around. She spent the next 3 days trying to edit the footage, watching frame by frame as the static occasionally cleared to reveal glimpses of horror. A woman in the third row whose mouth had been sewn shut with what looked like piano wire. A child whose eyes had been replaced with painted glass that still somehow tracked the camera's movement. And worst of all, an empty space in the fourth row, second pew from the back, where the wood seemed fresher, newer, as if it had been recently installed just for her. Her editor called demanding the story, but when Sarah tried to explain what she'd witnessed, the words came out as scripture, verse after verse of text she'd never learned spilling from her lips while her conscious mind screamed in protest. And she realized with mounting dread that the sermon was using her as a transmitter, spreading its influence through every conversation, every phone call, every human connection she attempted. On the fourth night, the dreams began. She stood at the pulpit looking out at the congregation while her mouth moved independently, speaking words that felt like broken glass in her throat. And she could see herself sitting in that reserved pew, her journalist self watching her preacher self with eyes that begged for release that would never come. She tried to write a warning article, fingers flying across the keyboard, but every word transformed into liturgy the moment it appeared on screen. Her investigative piece morphing into a religious tract that praised the eternal sermon and invited readers to attend services at Black Hollow Church. Complete with directions she didn't remember learning and service times that shouldn't exist for a building abandoned since 1983. Her roommate found her on the fifth morning standing at the window, fully dressed in clothes she didn't own. A modest floral dress from another decade. Sensible shoes that had been out of style for 40 years, a thin gold cross around her neck that burned cold against her skin. And when asked where she was going, Sarah heard herself say she was late for service, that the congregation was waiting, that the preacher couldn't continue without his full flock. The GPS in her car had already reprogrammed itself with Black Hollow Church as the destination, the route highlighted in red, like a vein pumping blood to a failing heart. And as she drove through the pre-dawn darkness, she passed 3 other cars heading the same direction. Their drivers wearing the same vacant expression she glimpsed in her rearview mirror. All of them new additions to the eternal congregation. All of them following the invisible threads the sermon had woven through their lives during their brief escape, pulling them back to fill the empty pews that had been waiting, always waiting, for fresh voices to join the silent choir. The church parking lot was already half full when Sarah arrived, her headlights sweeping across license plates from 3 different states. And as she stepped out into the thick morning fog, she recognized the other drivers from the highway. A truck driver who'd been reported missing 6 days ago, a family of 4 whose minivan had been found abandoned at a rest stop. All of them walking in perfect synchronization toward the glowing windows of Black Hollow Church. Inside, the congregation had swelled to nearly 60 people. The new arrivals sliding into pews that seemed to expand to accommodate them. The wood groaning and stretching like living tissue, making room for infection. And Sarah watched her body move down the aisle while her consciousness floated somewhere above. a helpless observer to her own damnation. The preacher's voice had changed, grown stronger with each new addition to his flock, his words now overlapping in impossible harmonies, as if multiple versions of the same sermon were playing simultaneously, each slightly out of sync, creating an audio spiral that made her teeth ache and her vision blur with vertigo. She took her place in the fourth row, second pew from the back, feeling the wood conform to her body like it had been carved specifically for her dimensions. And as she settled in, she felt something click into place, a horrible finality like a coffin lid closing. And she understood that the church itself was alive, feeding on their presence, growing stronger with each soul it trapped. The woman beside her, who'd been there since 1983, turned her head just a fraction of an inch. The first movement Sarah had witnessed from the original congregation. And Sarah saw tears that had carved permanent tracks down her cheeks over 4 decades. Her mouth forming a single word that took her 10 minutes to complete. Run. But running was impossible now, because Sarah's nervous system had been hijacked, her body operating on the church's schedule, breathing when the sermon paused for emphasis, blinking only when the preacher quoted scripture. Her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of his endless words until she couldn't tell where she ended and the congregation began. Through the windows, she could see more headlights approaching, drawn by social media posts she didn't remember making. By phone calls the congregation made in unison during the preacher's brief pause at midnight, their voices harmonizing to speak coordinates and promises of revelation, of truth, of answers to questions that would trap the curious in these pews forever. The preacher's face was the worst part. When Sarah finally forced her eyes to focus on him, she saw that he had no face at all, just a smooth expanse of skin with a mouth that opened impossibly wide, words pouring out like water from a broken dam. And she realized he wasn't speaking at all, but was being spoken through, a human amplifier for something that existed in the spaces between reality, something that had found a perfect feeding ground in this forgotten church, where faith had curdled into something hungry and patient and eternal. Days blurred into weeks as Sarah's consciousness fragmented, part of her still fighting while another part began to accept the horrible rhythm of eternal worship. And she discovered that the congregation shared a collective awareness during certain moments of the sermon, their minds touching briefly in a psychic network of shared suffering where she learned their names, their stories, how they'd each been drawn here by different promises, salvation, answers, peace, only to become batteries for something that existed beyond human comprehension. The preacher's words had become a language she no longer recognized, ancient syllables that predated human speech, sounds that made her bones vibrate and her blood flow in reverse. And she understood that the sermon wasn't meant for them at all, but was a continuous incantation keeping something sealed beneath the church, something that pressed against the floorboards during the deepest parts of night. Something that would destroy not just Black Hollow, but reality itself if the words ever stopped. Her phone, still recording in her pocket though the battery had died weeks ago, captured everything through some impossible means. The footage uploading automatically to a cloud server she didn't remember creating, tagged with GPS coordinates, and a message she watched her fingers type during the midnight pause. Don't come alone, bring 12. The mathematical precision of the trap became clear when she realized the church needed exactly 100 souls to complete its purpose. And they were at 91, the pews creaking eagerly for those final 9. And Sarah felt her body smile when she heard car doors slamming outside. A news crew responding to her uploaded footage, not knowing they were walking into their own imprisonment. The transformation began when the 97th person sat down, the church's wooden walls starting to pulse like a throat swallowing. The stained glass windows showing not biblical scenes, but writhing patterns that are hurt to perceive. Geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. And the preacher's endless words took on a triumphant tone, as if approaching some cosmic punchline that had been building for 40 years. Through the collective consciousness, Sarah felt the original congregation's terror spike as they realized what they'd been turned into. Not prisoners, but incubators. Their faith twisted and fermented over decades into something potent enough to birth whatever waited beneath the floorboards. And she understood that Black Hollow Church wasn't abandoned at all, but had been deliberately transformed into a supernatural pressure cooker, waiting for the exact moment when enough souls had marinated in endless sermon to become suitable vessels for something older than God Himself. The 98th and 99th arrivals were children, twins who'd wandered in from a broken-down car, and their presence changed everything. Their innocence acting like acid on the church's supernatural architecture, causing the walls to blister and weep a substance that looked like tears but burned like napalm where it touched the pews. And for the first time in 4 decades, the preacher's voice faltered just for a second. But in that second, Sarah heard the real sound underneath. Not one voice, but millions, all speaking the same words across infinite parallel churches, infinite congregations, all counting down to the same moment when the 100th soul would complete the circuit and transform Earth into something else entirely. A cathedral planet where every living thing would join the eternal sermon, frozen in worship of something that should never be worshipped. Something that had been waiting patiently in the spaces between spaces for this exact configuration of trapped souls to open the door wide enough for it to squeeze through. The 100th soul arrived not through the door, but through birth. Sarah's own body betraying her as something grew inside her over impossible minutes, aging from conception to emergence in the span of a single verse. And as the thing that looked like a child but moved like liquid smoke took its place in the final empty spot in the pews, the church began its metamorphosis. Walls folding inward like origami made of reality itself, revealing that Black Hollow Church had always been a cocoon, and now it was time to emerge. The preacher's face split vertically, revealing not flesh, but an infinite regression of smaller churches, each containing their own congregations, their own eternal sermons, fractaling into dimensions that made Sarah's mind splinter just trying to process what she was seeing. And she understood that every abandoned church across America, across the world, was connected to this moment. All of them breathing in unison, all of them ready to birth the same impossibility. The footage from her phone had spread across the internet like a virus, drawing thousands to seek out their own local abandoned churches, each one finding the doors mysteriously open, the pews mysteriously welcoming. And Sarah felt them all joining the network, felt humanity transforming into a single congregation listening to a sermon that would reshape the very fabric of existence into something that served the thing beneath. The thing that was no longer beneath, but everywhere, in every word, in every breath, in every thought. As her last fragment of individual consciousness dissolved into the eternal sermon, Sarah understood the cruelest truth of all. The church had never needed 100 souls. It had needed one soul to split into 100 pieces. And she had been dividing since the moment she'd entered, each version of her filling another pew, another role in this cosmic passion play. Until Sarah Chen became not a person, but a congregation unto herself, forever listening to her own voice, preaching words that would never, ever stop.